In the time that I have with you, I want to reflect on a couple phrases that we're all familiar with, phrases that have become so much a part of our discourse when thinking and talking about church and state. It's hard to have a conversation without engaging and encountering these phrases. And they are this phrase, separation of church and state, and its architectural equivalent of this wall of separation between church and state. And in the limited time that I have here, I'm going to focus more on the wall phrase, but much of what I have to say in regards to the wall could be said equally of the other phrase. Now, I'm sure you all know that these are phrases that are not to be found in the United States Constitution, nor are they found elsewhere in the organic law of the United States. So with that in mind, I want to pose three questions this afternoon. Where did these phrases come from? And again, I'm going to be focusing on this wall metaphor. Why are these phrases so influential in American legal and political thought? And finally, why should you care about the pervasive use of this metaphoric language of separation? And I start in 1947. The justices of the Supreme Court were asked to interpret the First Amendment's prohibition on laws respecting an establishment of religion. And the court famously declared, and I quote, "In the words of Jefferson, the First Amendment erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach." Now this case, 1947, is called Jefferson versus Board of Education. This opinion that I've just quoted from was written by Associate Justice Hugo Black. Now, this metaphor has in many respects come to dominate the way in which courts have talked about and articulated their views and interpretation of the First Amendment. And this is an influence that continues to the very day. Not that long ago, one of the justices wrote an opinion, and I quote, he says, "Our democracy is threatened." I'm going to start again. "Our democracy is threatened whenever we remove a brick from the wall that separates religion and government," end quote. It's a pretty startling statement, right? There's a lot at stake here with this wall one takes away from such a statement. Now, the rhetoric of Jefferson versus Board of Education, this 1947 case, laid the legal foundations for much of what we've witnessed in the last 7-8 decades, increasing restrictions on the place, the role, the voice of the religious community and religious ideas in the public marketplace of ideas. And at the foundations of this jurisprudence, we find Thomas Jefferson and this metaphor of a wall of separation. Now, I think it's fair to say that there's no metaphor in American letters that has had a more profound influence on law and policy than this wall of separation. In our own time, the wall of separation is often accepted by Americans as sort of a pithy, authoritative way of encapsulating First Amendment principles, First Amendment concepts. And certainly courts and commentators have embraced this metaphoric language as essentially a rule of constitutional law, supplanting in some respects the literal language of the First Amendment. And again, what is the source of this figure of speech, and how has this symbol of separation between religion and the state, or religion and public life, come to dominate our church-state law and policy? These are some of the questions that I explore in a book that I've written on Jefferson and his wall of separation. And in that book, I challenge some of the conventional secular myths that Jefferson, or the constitutional architects more generally, erected a high wall between religion and civil government. So let me invite you to step back with me about 200 years in American history. Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated the third president of the United States on March the 4th, 1801, following one of the most bitterly contested elections in American history. Now, my students like to complain about how dirty politics have become. And when I hear that, I say, you might want to go read a little bit about the election of 1800, right? If you want to know what down and dirty, politics looks like, read a little bit about the election of 1800. And one of the issues that sort of muddied those waters was a question about Jefferson's religion, or might I say, the alleged lack thereof. His critics had raised the issue of whether he was in fact an infidel, or maybe even worse, an atheist. And the campaign rhetoric was so vitriolic that when news of Jefferson's election began to spread across New England, there are eyewitness reports of housewives literally burying the family Bible in their gardens or hiding them in wells. Now, as bizarre as that might seem to us, why is that? Well, there at the end of the century, Americans were beginning to hear some rather alarming reports about what was going on in the French Revolution. And by this time, the revolution in France had turned bloody and anti-Christian. And one of the main grievances against Jefferson, and one of the bases for this claim that he was perhaps an infidel or atheist, was his friendship with a number of the leaders of the French Revolution. You remember, he had served as the American ambassador, essentially the American minister in France. And so it was not that difficult for those who looked at Jefferson with some skepticism to imagine that he would bring to America this same spirit, this same de-Christianizing movement that we're beginning to hear reports about over in France. And there was a de-Christianizing movement as part of the revolution. Mobs would sometimes go into churches or cathedrals and tear down the cross, or there are reports in the French Revolution of mobs tying the communion chalice to the tail of an ass and then parading them through town. And again, you can see how some Americans who are not looking at Jefferson with great favor might imagine that he's going to bring that same sort of spirit, that same wave to America. Jefferson, of course, was a Virginian, a son of the South. His opponent in that election was John Adams of New England. Talk about red states, blue states. There perhaps has never been an election when the red states were redder and the blue states were bluer. There are eyewitness stories about how on election night, selectmen in a very large town in Virginia gathered to count the ballots. And as they go through the ballots, every single one was cast for Thomas Jefferson, save one. And they were sure that that was a mistake, so they summarily threw it out, right? But the point is, we talk about polarization today, but this is polarization on an even bigger, in a bigger sense. Whole parts of the country, you would be hard-pressed to find a single supporter of the other candidate, so to speak. Now, there was, again, John Adams of New England, there was one pocket, and I will say, one pocket of support for Jefferson in New England. And interestingly enough, it was to be found among the Baptists, who were largely located geographically in the western parts of Massachusetts, if you know that area, the Berkshire Hills over near Pittsfield, places like that, or western Connecticut. And the Baptists supported Jefferson because they were a religious minority in Congregationalist New England. Congregationalist New England still had essentially an established church. And as we've already noted, it's overwhelmingly Federalist in its political affiliation, as opposed to Jefferson, who's more Republican Democratic in his political affiliation. So the New England Baptists find themselves a minority two times over. They're a religious minority as well as a political minority there in New England. Again, in a region that's dominated by this Congregationalist Federalist axis. So on New Year's Day, 1802, President Jefferson in the White House penned a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association of Danbury, Connecticut. Now, the Baptists had written the president a letter. It's dated October 7th, 1801, and it's a letter that can only be characterized as a fan letter, okay? Remember, these are the only supporters of Jefferson in New England. So they write him a letter and they are celebrating his election to the Chief Magistrate of the United States. That's their language. But they go on to celebrate Jefferson, and I think this gets to why they support him in the first place. They see themselves, these Baptists, as a persecuted minority in New England. And they're hoping that Jefferson will bring to the nation as president the same spirit in support of religious liberty that he had championed in Virginia. Jefferson, you may recall, had written the celebrated Statute of Virginia for establishing religious freedom, one of the great statements of religious liberty in American political history. And the Baptists are hoping that he will promote that same spirit at the national level that he had promoted there in Virginia. Now, let me just say as an aside here, in a day before televised presidential news conferences, it was hard for presidents to speak to the American people. And writing to a constituent group was one of the best ways that a president could communicate to a wider audience. Now, Jefferson is going to sit down and write to the Danbury Baptist, but he's speaking to a much larger audience because he knows the Baptists are going to go down to the local newspaper. The letter's going to be printed. It's going to be printed in the newspaper in the next town, and the next town, and the next town. So whenever you see a president in these early days writing a letter to a civics organization, fraternal organization like this, he's not just writing that organization. In all likelihood, he's speaking to a larger audience. And that's certainly what's going on here. And so in a carefully crafted reply, Jefferson responds to the Baptists. The letter, by the way, gets to the White House from the Baptists probably December 30th. He answers his mail promptly, email promptly. A little good advice there for you. And so he's writing back the next day, December 31st. And in his letter, he wrote this. He said, Congress, and he doesn't use that word Congress, but he speaks of the legislature, the national legislature. And then he works himself into a quotation from the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So right now he's quoting directly from the First Amendment. And then he follows this with a comma and then adds these words, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. And so this language, this separationist language of the wall, enters into the American political lexicon. Now, Jefferson here is I think I'll hold off on this point, but I suggest in my book that if you look at the letter that Jefferson writes in its context, what we're going to discover is that the wall today has come to be used in ways that I think are very different than what Jefferson intended or had in mind. And in fact, I think we often see the wall used today in ways that Jefferson would perhaps even repudiate. Now, let me suggest a couple things that I think are going on here in the letter, as well as Jefferson's larger sort of position on issues of church and state. The first thing I would note is this. Throughout Jefferson's public career, including 2 terms as president, Jefferson pursued policies that are clearly incompatible with a modern understanding of a high and impregnable wall of separation. For example, he endorsed the use of federal funds to build churches and to pay for missionaries working with Native Americans. This is precisely the kind of policy that would take the modern court about 15 seconds to declare unconstitutional. Why? Because it violated the wall of separation. Right? So we have to confront a little bit of a conundrum here. Is it possible Jefferson knowingly or in some sense deliberately pursued policies that were incompatible with his own wall of separation? Or perhaps there's another interpretation or understanding of his wall that the court hasn't quite comprehended. The second point I want to make here, and this in many respects gets to the core of my thesis, and that is this. I think Jefferson's wall, rightly understood, is more about federalism than about church-state relations. So as a matter of federalism, just to be clear here, we're talking about a political system that separates powers between a central authority and regional authorities. So again, my argument is that Jefferson's wall, as a matter of federalism, was erected between the national government and state governments on matters related to religion, rather than a wall erected between church and state. Okay? And I want to sort of flesh out that argument. I hope I offer copious evidence in support of this thesis, because it's not one that many people are, or at least initially, accustomed to hearing. The evidence, I think, for this interpretation can be found both in the text as well as the context of Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists. And I just want to give you a bit of the contextual argument. So Jefferson tells us very clearly why he's interested. Again, you remember he's writing to the Danbury Baptists, but he's speaking to a larger audience. He tells us very clearly why he wants to write this letter. He wants to address one of the major controversies early in his presidential administrations. And this is the controversy. Jefferson, unlike Adams and unlike Washington, as president, was declining to issue religious proclamations for days of prayer, fasting, and thanksgiving. Now, his critics latched on to that to say, there's the evidence that he's an infidel, right? Who but an infidel president would decline to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation? And this has become a bit of a controversy that he has to deal with, and so he wants to explain his position. Now, what's interesting here is that as governor of Virginia, Jefferson had issued Thanksgiving Day proclamations. In fact, in Virginia, as a member of the Virginia legislature, Jefferson had written a bill authorizing the governor of Virginia to issue religious proclamations, and it even included the punitive measure that if a minister of the gospel did not hold a religious service on a day designated by the governor for prayer and thanksgiving, that minister could be fined, right? Now, what I want us to try to figure out is, how do we reconcile Jefferson as president refusing to issue religious proclamations, and Jefferson as a public official in Virginia where he is engaged in precisely that very activity? Now, let me remind you, where's the wall? It's between the national government and state governments on matters pertaining to religion. He's saying in this letter, in essence, as president of the United States, I have strictly delegated powers. Only those powers given to me in the Constitution. There's nothing in the Constitution that talks about the president having the power to issue presidential proclamations. If you want a religious proclamation, the place to go is to your state authorities, your state officials. Again, affirming that the wall is placed not between church and state in all their manifestations, but between the national government and state governments on matters pertaining to religion. Let me just say that this is a lingering controversy that Jefferson has to deal with throughout his presidency. In fact, this is such a significant controversy, his refusal to issue religious proclamations, that he takes time out of his second inaugural address to come back to this very question. And again, to try to explain to the American people why he's not issuing Thanksgiving Day proclamations. And notice what he says, and I quote, "In matters of religion, I have considered that its free exercise, that is free exercise of religion, is placed by the Constitution independent of the powers of the national government. I have therefore undertaken on no occasion to prescribe the religious exercises suited to it, but have left them as the Constitution found them under the direction and discipline of state governments or churches." So he's telling us once again where he has placed his wall. So again, the wall of separation as Jefferson envisioned it is really more about federalism, separation of powers between central governments and regional governments. But here we are, 2 centuries later, and his metaphor remains enormously influential. But it remains controversial to some extent. And the question that is bitterly debated is, does this wall of separation illuminate or obfuscate our understanding of important constitutional principles about church-state relations? The wall's defenders argue that it promotes private, voluntary religion and freedom of conscience in a secular polity. The wall prevents religious establishments and avoids sectarian conflict among denominations, competing for government favor and aid. A regime of strict separation, defenders say, is the best, if not the only way to promote religious liberty, especially the rights of religious minorities. Now, my response is I think there's a lot of truth in that. Right? History tells us that unions of church and state have oftentimes been engines of intolerance, even persecution. And I certainly would not argue for a union of church and state. Rather, I would argue, and I believe this is what the Constitution mandates, that religion should be granted at least equal access in the public marketplace of ideas with any other form of expression, any other form of debate and persuasion. But I worry, and this is what excites my interest in this topic, I worry that in our own day, the wall of separation has more often than not become an instrument for restricting the voice of religion, the perspective of the faith community in that marketplace of ideas. The wall metaphor, I believe, has been a source of much mischief in modern church-state jurisprudence. It is reconceptualized. Indeed, I would say it has misconceptualized First Amendment principles, and it's done so in several ways. And I want to walk through a couple ways, several ways perhaps, in which I think the wall misconceptualizes First Amendment principles. First, Jefferson's wall emphasizes, obviously, separation between church and state. This is unlike the language of the First Amendment. The language of the First Amendment is non-establishment of religion. But here we sit in the 21st century, and we oftentimes use these words interchangeably, right? Mean the same thing. They did not mean the same thing in the lexicon of the early 19th century. Separation was viewed as a more expansive concept, more limiting perhaps on the place of religion in the broader society and culture, whereas non-establishment was a narrow institutional concept. It was about denying the ability to establish a church in the way that there was a Church of England, for example, in England. And there's some evidence that I go into in my book, and I won't rehearse it here. There's some evidence that the Baptists were actually a bit discomfited by this letter, because the Baptist agenda was an agenda of disestablishment, not some kind of expansive limitation on the influence of religion in public life, or the ability of religion to inform the public ethic, or the ability of religion to sort of contribute to public debates on matters of law and public policy. The Baptists, like virtually all Americans of that age, feared that the removal of religion from the public sphere would actually undermine the very stability of Republican self-government. This was a generation that believed that religion was absolutely essential in nurturing the kinds of civic virtues that people required in order to govern themselves. And the Baptists, again, like most Americans, would have been a little bit uncomfortable with a conception that restricted too greatly the role and influence of religion in public life. A second concern about the use of a wall of separation, and that is, this has everything to do with the very nature of a wall. And I think the wall itself as a concept reconceptualizes First Amendment principles. A wall obviously is a bilateral barrier, right? If we have a wall here, it's as hard to get from side A to side B as it is to get from side B to side A. And that, however, is unlike the First Amendment. If we read the First Amendment, it begins with these words, Congress shall make no law. If there is a restriction in the First Amendment, it's a restriction on one entity and one entity only. Congress. Well, we can take some liberties perhaps and say it's a restriction on government more broadly, but it's a restriction on one side, so to speak. But if you take the literal language of the First Amendment and replace it with a wall, we now have something that restricts whoever's on either side of that barrier. And so now the First Amendment is transformed from being a restriction on government only to now being a restriction on the church or the religious voice or the community of faith. And that's a transformation of the First Amendment that's going to have big consequences for the religious voice in public life. The various First Amendment guarantees, there's a kind of a common structure that we find in the 5 guarantees in the First Amendment. And I think this is helpful to understand what's going on with the restrictions, whatever they might be, on religion in the First Amendment. And I like to use a parallel here. One of the other rights mentioned in the First Amendment is freedom of the press. Freedom of the press. And so the question I will ask of you rhetorically is this. Is freedom of the press written into the First Amendment to protect government officials from nosy journalists? Or is it written into the Constitution to protect the free and independent press from the rough and corrupting hand of the state? Well, it's the latter. And what I would invite you to do is take that same structure back into the religion provisions. Do we have freedom of religion to protect government from being informed or influenced, God forbid, by religion? Or is it to protect the church, to protect religion from the intrusions and depredations of the civil state? It's about protecting religion, not protecting the state. And that's why if you replace the First Amendment with a wall, now it suddenly becomes something that limits and restricts the ability of the church, the religious perspective in the marketplace of ideas. And so I would say any construction of Jefferson's wall, that imposes restraints on entities other than civil government exceeds the limitations imposed by the First Amendment. But it gets worse. The notion of separation and application has not only imposed an extra constitutional restraint on religion, but also has dangerously granted the civil state de facto powers over religion. Having assumed the separation of church and state, the civil state today, typically acting through the judiciary, has then exercised the prerogatives to specify the legitimate jurisdictions of both the church and the state. In other words, we find the courts today stepping in and being the umpire, telling the church, oh, you can't do that because that will violate the wall of separation. But do you see where that leaves us? We start with the literal language of the First Amendment, which is a restriction on government only, to now with a wall, we've empowered the state to tell the church what it can and cannot do. Now, I take that to be sort of turning the First Amendment on its head. And it's going to be a transformation that's going to have a profound implication for religious perspectives in our society today. We see the separation principle often invoked to restrict religion's place in public life, but all too infrequently is it used to protect the church from the intrusions and depredations of the civil state. So I would say, let's not kid ourselves. The wall of separation has been used to empower the state to control the church. In fact, even to silence the church quite often, and to limit the reach of the faith community into public life. And that, I think, is why we should care about this metaphoric language. It's not the language of the First Amendment. It's a transformation of the First Amendment. We should care because the wall is used to separate religion from public life. thereby promoting a religion that is essentially private and a state that is strictly secular. And I think this would have been alarming to the American founders because they viewed religion, to paraphrase George Washington's farewell address, as an indispensable support for social order and stability. Think about that for a second. Probably the most famous line, almost immediately, the recognized money quote in the farewell address was this line of Washington: of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In other words, religion plays a vital, essential role in this project of self-government. As I just alluded to a minute ago, the prevailing view of this generation is that there must be a religious voice in order for self-government to succeed, right? A people have to have an internal moral compass to facilitate self-government. And what's going to nurture that internal moral compass? Well, Washington's telling us his opinion. It's religion and morality. And by the way, he goes on in the very same paragraph to say he engages in a little bit of a thought exercise. He says, well, maybe we can just go on the morality thing without the religion stuff. But he says both experience and reason teach us that you can't have morality without that infusion of the religious perspective. That was his view, right? We can debate that, but that's his view. And by the way, lest you think he's not terribly serious about this, having said religion and morality are indispensable supports, do you know what he says in the next line? We often skip over this line. Maybe it makes us a little too uncomfortable. In the very next line, he says this: in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these firmest props of human happiness. Now just think about that for a second. That's a pretty stunning statement. He's saying, having just said religion and morality are indispensable supports for political prosperity, he now says if you're laboring to undermine those indispensable supports, you can't call yourself a patriot. Pretty strong stuff. Pretty strong stuff. And by the way, this was mainstream views in Washington's day, right? This was an uncontested perspective, I would say. By the way, just a little gossip. You like gossip? Almost immediately again, remember what does Washington say? In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism. Wags up and down the Atlantic seaboard began to wonder, when he said that man, did he have someone in mind, or was it just a generic throwaway line? And those who said he had someone in mind, guess who he had in mind? The infidel, right? Thomas Jefferson, right? And that's why there were many people of faith that were very genuinely concerned about the election of Jefferson, that he, in his perspectives, would begin to undermine that indispensable support of religion and morality. So today, the wall of separation has become something like a sacred icon of a separationist dogma, often intolerant of religious influences in the public arena, and receive federal and state courts now over the decades using this wall of separation to justify censoring private religious expression in public fora, denying public benefits such as education vouchers for religious entities, and excluding religious citizens and organizations such as faith-based social welfare agencies from full participation in civic life on the same terms and conditions as their secular counterparts. There's hardly a week that goes by that I don't get a call from someone who wants to bring to my attention some church-state issue, and I can't tell you how often it boils down to what I take to be a misunderstanding of the First Amendment that arises from this very thing we're talking about, replacing the literal language of the First Amendment with this wall of separation. I'll tell you a very simple story that I think illustrates. It's one of the very early case I worked on as a lawyer. There was a family that lived very close to where I live. They had a child who was in elementary school who was a special needs child, and she went to a special school, and You know, sadly, sometimes kids who go to special schools, they have their own bus route, and it's the bus route that just goes on because they have to pick up kids all over the county and take them to whatever the school. And this poor girl had an hour and a half ride to school every day in the morning and an hour and a half back every night. And she took it upon herself to use this time in a wise way. She decided that she was going to read her Bible to herself as she's riding the bus. The driver of the bus, this is a public school bus, the driver of the bus says, "You can't read that. Haven't you heard about the First Amendment, right? Separation of church and state." And took the Bible away from her, right? Now, the issues here, I think, are so simple that I would hope a first-year law student would be able to sort of tell us that something's not quite right here, right? And the reason why I got involved is the family thinking this isn't quite right, go to the principal. Principal just backs up the school bus driver saying, "Don't you know about this separation of church and state stuff?" Right? Now, here's my point. You can't find yourself in a case like this if you're reading the First Amendment. That little girl is not the government. She's not Congress. But if you replace the First Amendment with this wall of separation, now you can see the plausibility of this claim is you can't bring your religion into a public arena, right? And I hear about these kinds of cases over and over again, right? And I'm sure you do as well. And again, it's a problem we encounter, not from the First Amendment, but from the replacement of the First Amendment with this wall of separation. So let me just conclude. There's a lot more I'd like to talk about, but we could look at how the wall has been used historically to exclude people of faith. One of the early examples when we begin to see politicians rhetorically using the language of separation of church and state, it wasn't to maximize liberty, it was to restrict the liberty of the community of faith. We find Jeffersonians using the language of separation to tell Congregationalist clergymen that they couldn't engage in debate over the election of 1800. Now think about what's going on there. They're using this wall to silence the community of faith in their engagement with public debates, political debates in that nature. And we're going to see that over and over again. And I wish I had more time, but I'll just give you a little flavor of this now. There's a really ugly side to this separation language. Very interesting. There are people who do these word searches and they see how phrases are used over time in public discourse and things like that. It's very interesting. And there's a couple little bumps as we go along, and then we hit 1840, 1850, and the use of separationist language goes like this. What's going on, 1840, 1850? Any ideas? Okay. Has a lot to do with a famine on the other side of the Atlantic. Catholics, immigrants are starting to come to America, and the language of separation of church and state is being used to marginalize Catholics from participation in public life. So it's part of a nativist, the know-nothings. You remember the know-nothings, right? It gets worse. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, a support for the American principle of separation of church and state has been woven into virtually every Klan oath. Think about that for a second. You know, we think of the Klan today almost exclusively in terms of their views and positions on race. We sometimes forget that their animosity towards Roman Catholics was perhaps as much a motivating factor at the end of the 19th century as some of their views on race. Right? Brings us back to Jefferson versus Board of Education. Remember, 1947, opinion written by Justice Hugo Black, Alabama Ku Klux Klansman. This is a man who early in his life affirmed support for separation of church and state as part of a Klan oath, right? Now, I want to be very careful here because this is pretty strong stuff. There are a lot of traditions, political and religious, that embrace a view of separation of church and state. I myself come from a faith tradition, and I hold to that tradition to this day. Believe that God has divinely ordained the church for a certain function and has ordained the state for a certain function, and the twain should not meet, right? So I myself hold to that position. I just want to put on the table here that in the American experience, especially coming out of the 19th century, there's this very ugly strain of separation of church and state thought that is very much wrapped up in kind of anti-Catholicism. And I think we have to be aware of that, because this is language that is freighted with some ugly things in the American experience. So, Jefferson's figurative language has not produced the practical solutions to real-world controversy that its apparent clarity and directness led its proponents to expect. Indeed, this wall has done what walls frequently do, is it has obstructed the view. It has obfuscated our understanding of constitutional principles governing church-state relationships. The repetitious, uncritical use of felicitous phrases, just as Felix Frankfurter once observed, bedevils the law. To quote Frankfurter, he says, "A phrase begins life as a literary expression. Its felicity leads to its lazy repetition, and repetition soon establishes it as a legal formula, undiscriminatingly used to express different and sometimes contradictory ideas. Figures of speech designed to simplify and liberate thought end often by trivializing or enslaving it. Therefore, as Judge Benjamin Cardozo said, metaphors in law are to be narrowly watched." This is one metaphor that we should watch very carefully.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.